Legends of the Dead is the newest Crusader Kings 3 DLC, which has released to an interesting sort of acclaim. On my stream, I predicted an 8 or 9 out of 10 to be the most likely score that most content creators and the wider public would give to it, as this DLC, from what I could tell, is extremely appealing to a large section of the community. So far, one proud Bavarian, who I consider to be the most normie, not in an insulting way, just factually, content creator, has given the DLC a 9 out of 10, and the Steam reviews are at 87% positive. This is important because I want to set the stage a bit before talking about my thoughts. I want to get one thing out of the way. This DLC is a good DLC, period. If we were to create a tier list of DLCs, the top pick is, objectively, Tours and Tournaments, followed by maybe Legacy of Persia, after which the prestigious third slot is to be fought out between anything else except Royal Court, whose only redeeming factor is that its free update was extremely good. That's my opinion, which is much more hardcore than, say, a random player who doesn't speedrun, or more casual content creators like One Proud Bavarian. If I were to strawman a normie CK3 player, the tier list would be more like Tours and Tournaments followed by Northern Lords, then Royal Court, and after that it's a toss-up between Legacy of Persia and Fate of Iberia, with, I think, Legacy of Persia winning out. It's universal consensus that event packs go on the bottom, from what I can tell. This is important for creating a barometer of thoughts and opinions. I am aware that I'm hardcore and that most people are not. For that reason, I'm going to approach this review from both perspectives. As a normie, this DLC is a 9 out of 10, but as a hardcore player, it's more like a 6 out of 10. In this video, I'll talk about why my personal opinion is so much lower, and talk about what this DLC appeals to in players which makes it a 9. I have critiques and praises, and we'll start with the critiques so as to end on a high note with praises. Let's get into it. No DLC is ever perfect, and if you asked me to sit down and pick at even something like Tours and Tournaments, I'd find issues, but ultimately the question is what the critiques are and which part of the game they bring down. Tours and Tournaments to me is a great pedestal to look up to when determining any DLC's quality. Briefly, Tours and Tournaments fulfill the 3 important aspects of any given CK3 DLC's rating: the mechanics, the roleplay, and the intrusiveness. Tours and Tournaments, mechanically, was an extremely important money sink for the mid and late game, which the game desperately needed, and it provided powerful artifacts alongside ways to quickly acquire large amounts of prestige for less warlike characters. Grand activities in general made playing peaceful characters much more interesting. Roleplay-wise, it created rivalries and stories between tournament members, and the traveling system provided a cool way to represent your character going to new lands and seeing new places. In terms of intrusiveness, you never had to interact with any piece of Tours and Tournaments if you didn't want to. That's important because, although I think Tours and Tournaments is great, it sucks to be forced to do anything in a sandbox, especially if that particular mechanic is disruptive to the game. The travel system risked being intrusive, but ultimately wasn't, because you certainly could min-max your travel routes, but it's totally fine to just use the pre-made route that always gets put up and never even consider custom routes. Beautiful execution. Okay, now let's use that 3-point system to look at Legends of the Dead. The largest, obvious contribution the Legends of the Dead brings is the Legends system. Legends are extremely expensive, albeit there's a game rule for their price that you can tweak, and they provide buffs to characters and counties based on how much they've spread. The legend increases its effects at 100 baronies and then again at 300 baronies. According to my testing, a legend can't go further than 500 baronies, and there's no reward for hitting any more than 300. At 300, you've maxed out the legend. Legends were a system which, I will admit, I had astronomical expectations for, and my immediate reaction to them was quite negative for one very critical issue. There are, effectively, 3 legends in the game. To be clear, there are uniquely named legends, but each one falls under a particular type, and that type has the exact same effect and rewards as every other of its type. Some legitimizing legends come with a special ancient culture marker that lets its owner eventually diverge a new culture that has a dead heritage and language if they want. This is the only unique thing to any legend. Also, legends are static, and before you get on me about how actually the Chronicle text changes in some events, and that you can get new modifiers added to the legend, I want to make it very clear that Chronicle text changes are, and I'm sorry to do this, so poorly written that I don't care. Mechanically, the little modifiers that get tacked on to legends from some random events are inconsequential in most cases. There are a handful of legend modifiers that are more impactful, like the one that gives you stress loss buffs per level of fame, or there was one that gave more martial lifestyle XP, but I invite you to consider a cost-benefit analysis with the game rules on normal legend costs. Legend owners gain a handful of stats, and the counties with the legend gain a tiny trickle of development, and then let's add all the very best legend modifiers to the legend. At mythical level, legends are damn expensive. We're talking like half your gross income level expensive. Let's say I maintain my legend for 10 years, at a cost of 10 gold per month. That's 120 gold per year, which means 1200 gold over 10 years. 1200 gold is a lot of money, which could have been put into trade ports, farms, men-at-arms, and so on. The development gained by even one trade port already beats out a mythical legend, but obviously 3 or 4 which you could have made would completely destroy it. The MAA stack you could have hired and maintained on 1200 gold will let you conquer counties that are far more valuable than anything legend gives you passively. That leaves us with the bonus for completing the legend. If you choose to end the legend, you lose all effects of the legend even though it stays on the map for a bit. Although it remains present, all its effects are immediately ended, so don't be fooled. By ending the legend, it's gone. Its vestiges remain for only flavor purposes. The rewards for completing a mythical legend are, quite frankly, pretty cool. Bet you didn't expect that. I do mean it. They're cool, but they're the same across all legends, and that's the problem. Legitimacy is nice, and all legends give legitimacy, which is good. Legendary buildings are a bit underwhelming, especially because you can't choose where they go directly. The heroic legends give a legendary adventure CB and the demand fealty CB, both of which are quite good, as being able to conquer a whole kingdom as an adventure is great fun. Demand fealty is fun, but not that useful, since taking in a big vassal of the wrong faith and culture will often be pretty painful to your realm as a whole, but it can be useful for emperors that want to take over a large king in one go. Evangelizing the realm, as part of a holy legend, is amazing for pagan faiths, which otherwise might find conversion quite difficult. The effect is literally just 50% of your realm counties become your faith. That's damn good. Finally, legitimizing legends give you a claim on a particular empire, which for the historical legends is quite useful. Any character who completes the Gothic heritage gets claims to all of Hispania, and the Roman heritage one, hilariously, gives claims to all of the Roman Empire, which doesn't exist in the game until someone reforms it. Nice one. For the procedurally generated legitimizing seeds, it gives a claim to the empire of whichever character it spawned from, and their de jure hierarchy. So if the seed came from a character who came from Italy, you get a claim on Italia, and so on. These are indeed solid effects, but they are the saving grace for legends. It's certainly nice to get that stuff, but it's almost impossible to justify given the cost in gold. It's a toss-up, ultimately, since it's also quite easy to just set the cost of legends to be lower so that the player and the AI are incentivized to do more of them and access these cool rewards. But this brings me to another important failure, mechanically, of the DLC, the AI. The AI loves to start legends and then end them long before they've gotten any fame on them, which gives pretty mediocre rewards. It really sucks that the AI rarely holds on to legends for an amount of time that lets them really grow and become something interesting. Of course, it's the correct move, since legends are so expensive for so little that playing optimally the AI is actually making the correct choice. That being said, I'm no meta slave, and I think it should be the case that a mechanic shouldn't necessarily have to be meta to be worthwhile. The roleplay value of legends is an important part of their function in the game, so I want to take a look at that now. This is something which I don't think falls quite as flat, but which does, to some extent, leave me wanting more. The idea of venerating either yourself or an ancestor of a legendary chronicle is great. I like that because it gives a certain immortality to any character who can have their corpse paraded about as the protagonist of a story that they had no hand in. The problem is how little influence the nature of a particular character, and in fact the influence just about anything, has on the legend. Your legend's text may change according to some random events whose weight I assume is based on your character's traits and the traits of the protagonist, but beyond that, the legend will not change in its nature according to such things. Again, the furthest change you'll see between legends is the small modifiers that become attached to them, but their impact is so little that I don't even notice them. It's not like the text of the legend ever substantively changes, instead gaining tiny little references to events that I had no hand in. This is the issue: passivity. I cannot drive my legend in any particular direction, be it mechanically or roleplay-wise. I can only watch as things happen to my chronicle, and I make choices around that. I wish I could cause the legend to evolve via my actions, even if it legitimately only changed the text and doesn't actually do anything to the mechanical impact of the legend. Imagine a character with a heroic legend who has one of the attractive genetic traits, like beautiful, and then seduces, let's say, 10 women. If that were to happen, there could be a new chapter added to the chronicle about how seductive the protagonist is, even if it was the writer who did the seductions. This is because the writer has a ton of influence in the story of the character. The closest to this idea I've seen was when I did a Holy Site seed as a Jewish character with an Asatru father. I made the Asatru character the protagonist, and eventually I got an event that said it would retroactively change my father's faith to Rabbinic Judaism. Of course, it's hilariously ironic that the event didn't work and my father remained Asatru, but that was also in the early access build, so who knows if it got fixed. The only change I'd make to that idea, changing the protagonist's faith to match the Holy Legend, is to make it an active choice instead of a reactive event. I'd like a decision, or better yet, a scheme, since I think that would make sense for this sort of thing, to influence the chronicle. Doing it with schemes makes sense, but the problem is who to target. I'd say you target the protagonist of the story, whose stats are used against your scheme. If you pick a much more legendary protagonist, obviously the story is more legendary because its protagonist is cooler, but it's harder to alter the legend of a character who is clearly your superior. If you chose yourself as a protagonist, then you influence the chronicle by your personal actions, not schemes. So if you want the protagonist to be Jewish, then convert to Judaism. If you want the protagonist to be a seducer, become a seducer, either with the trait or by seducing some number of people. You see what I mean? See, that change would immediately create a sense of dynamism between picking protagonists, since right now, it's just about checking for virtuous traits to get that tiny boost of legitimacy, or it's a roleplay choice with no real meaning. In essence, I'm asking for a sense of initiative with Legends. I want to direct my Legends, not have them direct me with events. It's such a hands-off system, which I wish wasn't the case. I will say that the option to be hands-off is appreciated. It would really suck if I had to constantly be scheming against my protagonist. I think it's important that interactions with these mechanics should always be a choice, which is where the intrusiveness factor comes in, which Legends actually greatly succeed in. There is no point where you ever need to interact with Legends, and this is a good thing. A mechanic which forces itself on you, akin to many of Royal Court's mechanics, make me dread them because I don't care to deal with them. One might argue that it's part of the difficulty, and that's a fair argument. Court Grandeur in Royal Court is an example of a factor of strategy that does not feel intrusive. I set some bars with money and get rewards, but the court events would always bother me. They pop up and force me out of the map into my court, which I don't care to look at. Artifacts were similar, not that I dislike artifacts overall, but all the artifacts I get become these chains around my character. Time to go delete all the crappy artifacts that my vassals demand from me and duel me for. Great. Oh no, I forgot to fix my artifacts and now I've lost it, so I've got to keep an eye on my artifact durability constantly, which is hugely intrusive. Legends are not like this. I can set a legend and basically entirely forget it and just hope it spreads. I can also manage it more closely, seeking out rulers that I can bribe to spread it and managing my chronicler's tasks to optimize it. This is great. Although legends sometimes feel not worth doing mechanically, I never feel punished for ignoring them, and that is something to commend. Obviously this is the critique section, so I won't linger on the positive too long, but a little dose of kindness might shake up the, so far, perhaps scathing critique. Overall, Legends are disappointing because of their lack of variety, their high cost for literal reward, and their lack of compelling roleplay. One thing I'd like to note especially is the reason why the mechanic is well received by a larger community despite it being pretty empty, and that's because it gamifies that which was previously abstract. When I play CK3, I am always thinking about the legends of my characters in my own headcanon. This is how I came up with my GIGACHAD story videos. These legends essentially codify the idea, and it's nice because not everyone has the mind for imagining the roleplay in their own head. That's not an insult, but it mostly refers to the fact that many players struggle to get by in CK3, where they focus on succeeding mechanically, so they feel, falsely, that the game is bereft of roleplay. In truth, the roleplay has always been on the player to create, but now roleplay is, in some way, part of the game. That being said, the Chronicles are very poorly written, but I'll say this in defense of it. The writing has to be general enough that no particular emotion can be ascribed to it, in case that writing's emotion does not correspond to the emotion of the player with regards to it. I completely understand that limitation. The Chronicle inherently has to be written generically so that no player can feel isolated by it. This is an unfortunate limitation of a sandbox game in general. I was previously harsh on the boring writing of the Chronicle, but then I stepped back and remembered that roleplay is on the player more than anything. And although the Chronicle chapters help, they're no replacement for the individual feelings and thoughts a human player may apply to their characters. In that sense, the mechanic maybe fails at its intention, which is why I'm harsh on it. This mechanic is meant to be a very roleplay-oriented system, which gives the player a sense of grandeur to the characters, but the writing is so laughable at times in its gruffness and lack of character that it actually removes personality from those characters. For me, it degrades the experience of thinking about my characters whose personalities are erased by Chronicles rather than explored, in my opinion. The mechanic's actual impact on gameplay is weak, albeit not as bad as the actively negative effect on the roleplay aspect. Legends are a terrible usage of cash, with only the completion of mythical legends being somewhat worthwhile, but ultimately falling short to just building a ton of buildings in your domain. That is solved by lowering the costs using the game rules though, which I do recommend. I have enjoyed greatly playing with legends on the very low cost, since then I can justify using them. Anyway, that's my critique for legends. I'll talk about the good things they bring, but later. I want to talk about plagues now, after which talk about legitimacy. Plagues are something I'm quite ambivalent towards. People herald them as some kind of huge difficulty increaser, and yes, they're something of a challenge, but ultimately plagues just kind of come and go and maybe kill some characters. It's funny because I feel weird just like completely not caring about it, but I actually don't have any strong critiques for plagues really. Plagues do their job. I just wish there was a little more dynamism around spreading them. Generally speaking, a plague of minor or major level will stay to one general region, but if I have a plague in Egypt with huge trade ports and I don't quarantine or anything like that, the plague ought to spread from my ports out to other ports within range because, well, wouldn't that be what happens? You never see a plague jump from one area to another as it spreads via trade, which is sad. Apocalyptic plagues do spread much further, but again, it's county to county, not human movement to human movement. It would be very cool if war had some kind of effect on plagues, in the sense that if my realm is plagued and I go to war, my soldiers should be bringing the plague with them to some extent. Plagues don't spread very interestingly, and every measure you can take is again handed down by events. Some events are absolutely absurd in their effects. For example, on stream once I got an event that let me effectively kill a disease in its tracks by quarantining every county which had the disease. It applies a county modifier which cut my taxes by 100% in those counties for 15 years. I assumed that would go away after the disease died out, but even after the plague ended, I was stuck with 11 more years of 0% taxation, among other huge negatives. That is ridiculous, and should never be clicked if those plagued counties are in your domain. You're better off watching your development get cut in half than sacrificing 15 years of taxes. This brings me to the same issue that plagues have as legends. There's far too much passivity. The quarantine button is only a thing for your capital, which you can choose to isolate via a decision. I do like that you can choose to hide in your castle, which is a fun little feature and has some cool events, but ultimately, plagues are a force which happens to you, and which you have to hope you get some lucky events to try and resist. In a way, it's natural that plagues would be so passive. What can you really do about them at the end of the day? I'm willing to be okay with such passivity with plagues only because of the nature of plagues. Your actions to prevent plagues are more macro-oriented, with hospices and that one duchy building being the new way to help stop them. Your court physician matters much more as well, and the fact that they now have a task that can increase your lifestyle XP means something that spot will almost always be filled in any character's court. I do wish that diseases were a bit more modular, since it gets boring seeing the grand total of 7 diseases in the game. Smallpox, measles, consumption, flux, bubonic plague, typhus, and dancing plague. The severity of a plague affects only its spreading, not its actual effects. Meaning an apocalyptic spread of consumption isn't even really that scary, since most characters can survive it with a relatively competent physician. What would have been interesting is if these 7 diseases acted as some kind of baseline disease upon which different effects could be applied based on some randomness with the disease when it spawns. It would be interesting to have diseases with different severity levels beyond their ability to spread. I'm no epidemiologist, but I assume that there can be more or less powerful strains of particular diseases. Alongside that, I'd like it if my court physician could study up on particular diseases to prepare for them preemptively. Again, using the 7 basic disease templates, it would be a cool and unintrusive form of active play to order my physician to focus on prevention for a particular disease. If my king has a ton of little kids, he might want to tell the physician to study the treatment and prevention of measles, which particularly affects children. If my king is old, he might tell the physician to focus on consumption, which is extra deadly to elders. You see what I mean? It's important to me that this idea is not intrusive, since you can also just not tell the physician to do so, in theory, and therefore not be forced into always picking what disease to focus on. I'm willing to accept that I'm asking for a bit much from what is, in essence, tended to be a passive system. I'm much more forgiving on the passivity of plagues because of their nature compared to legends. One thing I wish was a bit more fleshed out was the way plagues are named after people, cultures, and regions. It's a shame that all a plague being named after a person does is just change its name. If a plague that ravages a region is named after an individual person, would it not massively affect the reputation of that individual in the region? Would they not become a scapegoat or have aggression justified against them? Imagine if the King of France had a pox named after him which then spread to England. I think it would be reasonable, at the very least, for the King of England or local counts and dukes in the region that got infected to lose opinion of the King of France. I'd go as far as even giving a revenge-oriented CB based on stealing development from the counties of the character that spawned the plague as payment for the development lost by the plague. That CB, I imagine, would come after the plague ends. So imagine a generation of young men who lost either their parents or children to a plague from France, marching south and burning France down, or overthrowing the king there as a punishment. Maybe it could just be a humiliation which tanks the legitimacy of the target and gives it to the attacker. My point is that plagues had an opportunity to create rivalries between rulers who would want to push blame around on each other, but instead plagues just get named and that's that. In particular, I think a culture being blamed for a plague should really destroy cultural acceptance of that culture. If the Italian pox ends up in Occitania, I don't imagine there will be a forgiveness for a while. How that manifests is as simple as a change to cultural acceptance each month for each county infected by the disease. If 10 Occitan counties have Italian pox, then Occitan and Italian should lose acceptance of each other each month at minus 0.1 per county, so in this case, minus 1 per month. A truly apocalyptic disease, which is named after a culture, will see that culture blamed, scapegoated, ostracized, and hated for it. Now, my super ambitious idea here, which I accept as unrealistic, would be to use your court chronicler to spread propaganda to try and blame something or someone else for the plague. If you've got a plague named after you and it's hurting your relations, set your chronicler to a task which attempts to rewrite the origin of the plague to be from a particular character or culture using a scheme between the chronicler and the target. You can blame a culture by targeting the head of that culture, unless they don't have one, in which case you target any character of that culture, or you can blame an individual by targeting them. It's important to note that the chronicler controls the scheme, not you, so that way you don't waste your scheme slot on it. It does mean that your chronicler becomes much more important though. I should add here that although this stuff sounds very mechanical, I do firmly place it in the roleplay section, since these mechanics are very strongly oriented around the relations between people and characters. It's hard to delineate where roleplay and gameplay start and stop because of how mixed they are in a game like CK3, but ultimately these feel to me like roleplay aspects of plagues that were missed out on. That fear of plague intrusiveness does appear here again, but I will say that plagues are only intrusive to smooth-brained people like me. Plagues are very unobstructive in theory, as they kinda just happen, and then you get some events about it. Events are pretty unobstructive because you just click through them in an instant and they go away. The only critique I have is that some of these events have effects and modifiers that are way too extreme, which if you click absent-mindedly, how I often do, can unironically brick you. I mentioned that quarantine option before, which cut 100% of my taxes and I was suddenly bankrupt for 15 years, but there are other modifiers which can feel quite negative that last beyond the plague. For example, some choices can isolate regions and reduce their development, but those development reductions stick around for long after the plague is gone. The fix for this is just to make these modifiers go away when the plague is gone for a certain amount of time. Why would my county stay quarantined for 11 more years after the plague has disappeared? It feels pretty ridiculous. In this way, the plague and their county modifiers can feel intrusive because I have to closely check the lengths of these modifiers and consider if I want to risk having my choices with regards to plagues last way longer than they should. In theory, I like long-lasting consequences for plagues, but these consequences feel nonsensical and therefore are frustrating, not strategic. Beyond that, the core position task is chill, and it's easy to set it and forget it, as well as being easy to change it when you need to, so I'm happy about that. It can feel cheesy to have your position just be boosting your lifestyle XP and suddenly switch to stopping plagues, though any negative to the effectiveness of the plague prevention, but whatever, I'm getting nitpicky now. To summarize plagues, they're similar to legends in that they could have been more, but they get away with it without as much critique because plagues are inherently passive and dangerous. It's natural that plagues would be something which you can't do much about. They happen. You deal with them by suffering through them. You can't really control them, albeit I wish you could control the narrative around them as I mentioned before. Where plagues fall flat is that they do not act as scapegoats or reputation destroyers, with their greatest contribution to that idea being a tiny legitimacy malice to lords who have plagues spawn in their land. When I say tiny, I mean it's only 50 points, on a scale that goes up to 2100. The funniest part is that the death caused by a plague opens up options for funerals, which give far more than 50 legitimacy, so it ends up being hilariously profitable legitimacy-wise to have a plague happen. That's a convenient segue into legitimacy, which is part of the free update. I'll cover it quickly because it's much less of a complex system than the previous two we looked at. Legitimacy represents how well your character's reputation coincides with the expectations put on them by their subjects and vassals. High legitimacy means they're acting correctly and with propriety. Of course, that which is legitimate is the same across all realms, all cultures, all faiths, and all characters, and that is my chief complaint with legitimacy in CK3. What renders a king legitimate in his subjects' eyes ought to depend on where he comes from, what his faith is, and the nature of his vassals. This to me is the biggest missed opportunity for an interesting legitimacy system, which I'm only willing to forgive because ultimately it's a free addition, not something you pay for. The value of a free system, which does not negatively contribute to the game, is pretty much always positive since it is free. That being said, legitimacy does contribute negatively to the game, unfortunately, and that is because it is extremely overpowered. Obtaining max legitimacy and maintaining it is not very hard. A couple hunts, a couple funerals, a legend, or even just making a few titles, and you'll get there real fast. Once you hit max legitimacy, you can vassalize most characters, especially if you have True Ruler or Diplomatic Court. I did a campaign as Nubia on stream and was able to vassalize enough land to form 3 empires off of True Ruler, Diplomatic Court, and legitimacy. Absolutely insane. It can always be said that the player can simply not vassalize all those lords when they hit max legitimacy, but that's never a good answer to a balance issue. I would say legitimacy should still give this bonus, but every expansion of your realm should decrease legitimacy. It might sound counterintuitive, but the way I see it, more vassals means more expectations, and thus the character must prove the legitimacy once again to the new lords and subjects they've taken in. The same should be for warlike kings, who will certainly not be legitimate immediately in the new lands they took, unless they had a strong claim on the land, and their opponent had low legitimacy. To depose a legitimate king, as a less legitimate one, certainly should reduce your legitimacy, while the inverse should increase it. That would also make the assassination of legitimate kings important, since their role as immovable pieces on the board would make legitimacy matter more. Overall, legitimacy is a missed opportunity that throws the game balance out of order a bit, but also is innocuous enough that it's not a huge deal. I just would have liked to see more done with it. From here I want to pivot into some of the praises I have for Legends of the Dead, of which there are some, but I'll warn you that in general I'm quite critical, so this video might feel negatively oriented. I'll reiterate that I do consider this DLC on the positive end of mid, putting it at about 6, maybe a 7 out of 10, and I do believe it'll get a 9 out of 10 in the public since it does a good job of appealing to what most players want. I'm not going to reiterate Legends, since if you've watched this far you should remember what they are, so here are my praises for them. Legends ultimately are not bloated, which is good. It's always a significant fear that a mechanic will be oversized for what it is and end up dragging the game down with its weight. This is not the case for Legends, as they have a focused set of mechanics that do not disturb other mechanics in the game. Providing money sinks for the mid and late game is nice, since many skilled players find themselves with hordes of money they simply can't spend. I love many of the mythical abilities in the game, such as Legendary Adventures and Realm Evangelization, and the ability to gain claims on empires and their lower realms is a worthy reward for a legend. Legends are quite unobtrusive in their implementation. Ignore them if you want, or focus on them completely. I like the way they keep your old rulers alive in a way, as puppets of your current lord's rule. Many of the events associated with Legends are quite cool and interesting, such as the ones that take you on trips to other places to duel people and the like. The roleplay available with Legends is wonderful, and overall, I am actually positive on Legends. The last thing I'll say as a positive for Legends is that they're extremely moddable. I went into the code on stream during early access and showed chat exactly how modular the Legends are, so it's quite possible to dive in, even for an amateur CK3 mod maker, to make some cool Legends themselves. It's never an excuse for a DLC to be subpar, but it's positive nonetheless that the code is flexible. The procedural generation of Legend seeds is a positive in my opinion, as one limitation we could have seen was that only historical seeds were available, and they'd get boring if we only could ever do those. New seeds spawning based on your actions is a good system and keeps the game fresh during long playthroughs that have already used up the historical ones. There also is quite a plethora of historical seeds, and of course it'll always be nice to see more, but the current set is enough. It's the type of system we'll definitely see expanded on in the future with more DLCs, which is nice. For plagues, I've got some praise for sure. Plagues are indeed dangerous and have high impacts on your realm. It's something to be actually afraid of, both in the short and long term, since they will kill your characters and kill your development. I like that plagues feel beyond your power, as they should, and you really can't stop them. You can stack your plague resistance high enough to slow them down a lot, but they will come. The added difficulty is fun, and thanks to the flexible game rules, you can make them as horrifically apocalyptic as you want, or make them relatively tame if you want an easier experience. I really appreciate game rules because they let me implement at least some of the changes I might want to see in the DLC, which I'd otherwise have to mod in. Plagues being named after particular characters and cultures and such is a huge positive, even if it's only a surface level addition, because ultimately, I as the player can roleplay the details in my own head. I personally enjoy a bit of vagueness in a mechanic if it lets my creativity flow better, and for Plagues, it does work out nicely that way. Plagues tie into legitimacy a little bit, albeit only minorly, and it's nice to see systems interacting with one another. Both Plagues and Legends implemented the minor title task system, which is a welcome addition that I'd love to see expanded on. Suddenly, the Chronicler and the position feel like much more important, and I keep those positions filled at all times. Legitimacy, as a system, I have a lot of positivity for in theory, since I love the idea, but ultimately it throws the game balance off too much for me to forgive. In concept, it's a good idea, and I like the roleplay potential, it just needs an overhaul mechanically in my opinion. What I see so much of in this DLC is unfulfilled potential, and I'm willing to accept that I have too high expectations. This happens to me every DLC, as my head runs wild with ideas and then the DLC fails to reach those ideas, as I sit here disappointed, while the wider community massively praises the game. This only didn't happen with tours and tournaments, which actually did meet and go beyond my expectations. Just hoping for more of that. Anyway, I know the praise section was short, but there should also be something said for the fact that I explained each mechanic in the critique section, so you know, I'm not that negative. If I were to put a number to Legends of the Dead, it'd be a high 6 or a low 7, maybe a 6.9 out of 10. And that's not a bad rating at all in my books. Don't be poisoned by the inflated scores of modern reviews. A 6.9 is above average and therefore good. To be a 9 out of 10, you've got to be something really legendary. A Legends of the Dead isn't quite that, but it's competent and a positive addition to the game. I think Legends of the Dead is going to be taken up by the modding community and turned into a much better DLC, given the moddability of these systems. In terms of the price of the DLC, which is 27 Canadian dollars, I'd say it's worthwhile. As with any Paradox game, if you want to play the full experience, you'll want every DLC anyway, and given the immense number of hours most people invest in the game, I imagine many of you will be getting this DLC, but if you're out on the fence, I will urge you to consider this one. It's pretty safe to skip out on Fate of Iberia or Legacy of Persia since they only concern particular areas, but Legends of the Dead adds cool new stuff to everyone and therefore justifies its price much more. With that, I take my leave and announce that I'm working on my own mod for Legends, which I went over on stream. I've put the design document for it in my Discord, and it's a flavor pack type deal to do with reviving the Achaemenid Empire. It uses legends, which I intend to make much more unique and interesting in the mod, and, without going into too much detail here, it's intended to be very dynamic, with different end goals and paths to those goals. Check the pinned messages in the CK3 channel in my Discord to read the document if you're interested, and feel free to ping me with any ideas or thoughts you might have just in general. Thank you for your time.